So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about how the exhibition came to be at the Guggenheim, sort of why at the Guggenheim, why now, and then I'm going to read a little bit of a paper on the correspondences between Hilma af Klint and Hilla Rebay, who is the founding director of the Guggenheim Museum. And I'm happy to take questions after, and also I will probably stop at different points and go off on some unrelated tangent. So I'm warning you now. But anyway, the exhibition, my familiarity with Hilma af Klint's work really came from seeing her work reproduced in Maurice Tuckman's 1986 catalog for the exhibition that he did at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art on abstraction and spirituality. And because of my work at the Guggenheim over these 25 years, mainly focuses a lot of my time on Kandinsky. That catalog has lived prominently over my desk for many years, so much so that I feel as if I saw the exhibition when I actually hadn't. And so I knew Hilma af Klint's work from that catalog and also from knowing Maurice a little bit. And he had always told me the story of how he was putting together that exhibition and a Swedish friend, curator, mentioned to him that there was this family in Sweden that had this body of work and he should include it in the exhibition. And that exhibition in '86 marked the first time that Hilma af Klint's abstract, spiritually based paintings were shown in a art world setting. For many years, we've been saying that it was the only time that the work was ever shown in her lifetime, after her lifetime. But we found out, in fact, with the publication of the book for this exhibition and the research that we were doing for the Guggenheim, that she actually did show a few of those paintings during her lifetime. And so that was kind of new news in the scholarship that we found for this exhibition. But the Guggenheim's kind of eccentric own take on early 20th century modernism really being based on our relationship with Kandinsky, which comes from Hilla Rebay's relationship with Solomon Guggenheim and her guiding him to the work of Kandinsky and Moholy-Nagy and other artists that she was showing with at the Der Sturm Gallery in Berlin before she came here to New York and met Guggenheim in about 1929, 1928. And so that has always set the Guggenheim's path of the story of those early years being really Kandinsky focused. We kind of hold that sometimes in opposition to MoMA's story that we feel is more Picasso driven and focused. And so the Guggenheim has always, or at least in my work with the collection of the Guggenheim, I've always tried to endeavor to embrace those eccentricities of our story. Which also is very heavily about the coinciding of spiritual pursuit and utopian goals and abstraction in those early years. And so this seemed, Hilma af Klint's work seemed a natural fit for our own history. It took a little while to convince the museum as a whole that it was the right exhibition for a rotunda sized exhibition at the museum, and we're very thrilled that it has taken place. Her work was not shown in New York. Well, it was in a drawing center exhibition that was wonderful that grouped her work with Emma Kuhn's and the work of Agnes Martin. It's been shown. R.H. Quaytman was a curator at PS1 in Queens when she convinced in 1989 the administration there to bring over a small focused exhibition on Hilma af Klint's work that her father, Harvey Quaytman, had seen in Scandinavia and brought back a catalog to her. And then were some works included in the New Museum in the Keeper exhibition, so again, sort of a kind of grouping her in a more outsider art kind of way. But largely the exhibitions that have told the story of those early decades of the 20th century and the invention of abstraction have not included her in their presentations. most notably in 2013 when the Moderna Museet in Stockholm put together an exhibition of Hilma af Klint's work, a very large retrospective of about 350 works that then traveled in Europe quite a bit. At the same time, the Museum of Modern Art here in New York had a wonderful exhibition called Inventing Abstraction. And in that exhibition, which was really reliant on the networks of people and who was where and what city and what were they reading and who were they interacting with to tell those stories of the beginnings of abstraction, Hilma af Klint was left out of that exhibition. And when one of the newspapers kind of called it out, Leah Dickerman, who's a friend and great curator and contributed to the Hilma af Klint catalog for this exhibition, she said that Hilma af Klint was a cul-de-sac, was a dead end, and that because no one saw the work during her lifetime, that she didn't have any legacy and that therefore she didn't fit into the story as it was being told. And at that same time, we committed ourselves to taking to organizing an exhibition. We thought we might be a venue for the 2013 exhibition, but then decided to do it ourselves, really because we wanted to kind of challenge that notion of telling that story of that time period with just people who were connected to other people, and that we felt that it was a moment where we could think more expansively about people and their geographies and their spiritual beliefs and religious beliefs and their gender to be more inclusive of how we lay out that, who begat who in those early years. So that's how the exhibition came about, and I will start us with the slide of the rotunda. Artist Hilma af Klint created 193 paintings between 1906 and 1915, known as the Paintings for the Temple, the ambitious cycle that would come to define her. These works are far removed from the conventional landscapes and portraits that she perfected while attending the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Stockholm years earlier. Rather, they are primarily abstract, with imagery born of botanicals and other natural forms that grew more simplified and geometric with time. Their production over the course of these years represents a radical effort by af Klint to find visual expression for a transcendent spiritual reality beyond the observable world. The titular temple was not one that existed anywhere in the world. She envisioned her paintings for the temple filling a round building where visitors would progress upward along a spiraling path on a spiritual journey defined by her paintings. The nature of that journey, like the spiritual visions that af Klint pursued in her paintings, involved a complex and idiosyncratic mix of religious and occultist beliefs, scientific concepts, and other intellectual trends of her day, which she drew from Christianity, Rosicrucianism, Buddhism, Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, theosophy, anthroposophy, and perhaps most fundamentally, spiritualism. However, this visionary sanctuary remained unrealized, and despite af Klint's grand plans for sharing her work, she showed only a few examples of her abstract paintings publicly during her lifetime. The artist came to believe that the Paintings for the Temple and the other abstract series that followed were beyond the understanding of her contemporaries and therefore best held for future audiences. Af Klint's story and her forays into abstraction in the early years of the 20th century were unknown to the artists who today are widely recognized as the pioneers of Western abstraction for works dating nearly a decade later: Kandinsky, Mondrian, Malevich, and Kupka. These artists, and much of their cohort, including Hilla Rebay, an artist who advised Solomon R. Guggenheim in his collecting, were working amid, if not directly engaged with, similar intellectual and spiritual beliefs as af Klint. Rebay, like af Klint, was guided by her belief in the spiritual dimension of abstract art as she formed the Guggenheim's collection, beginning in the late 1920s. And while Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum, built to house the work of this vanguard, was unimagined in the 1940s, until the 1940s, the spiral of its central rotunda held similar import as form and symbol to both Wright and af Klint. Af Klint records in her notebooks that she was informed in 1904 through a guide, Ananda, one of the spirits that she channeled on a regular basis, that she would be called on to convey the spiritual world in paintings. That same year, Georg foretold that she would be summoned to design a temple. And this is in one of her notebooks. Hilma af Klint left hundreds of notebooks, or 100+ notebooks, I should say, that record the various spiritualist meetings that she and the group of 5 women, 4 other women and Hilma af Klint, who met on a regular basis and conducted kind of religious meetings where they had a sermon and read from the New Testament and then conducted seances. All of these meetings are recorded, and different encounters with the spirit guides that they channeled are recorded in various notebooks that she has that she retained. I should mention also that towards the end of her life, she organized all of her correspondence and writings and eliminated quite a bit of it. And so mostly all of the biographical detail and personal correspondence was destroyed at that time. And so the story that we're left with of her life and her work is very much a curated conception of herself that she put together in the late years of her life. So the same year, and this is one of her notebooks where she, or the group, has indicated the kind of spirit forms that came to them on a regular basis. Georg foretold that she would be summoned to design a temple. The other members of the 5 were also asked if they would be willing to create paintings described by Ananda, but none accepted. Her Great Commission, the paintings for the temple, was received from Amliel on January 1st, 1906, when af Klint, at the age of 43, promised to dedicate a year of her life preparing to carry out the spirit's wishes in service of a new temple. And she wrote at the time, Amliel offered me a great commission, and I immediately replied yes. This became the Great Commission, which I carried out in my life. Little is known about the temple building and the temple building itself and how much it occupied af Klint when she commenced her work. Within the artist's extant writings and sketches and notes describing her plans for the temple, there's no indication of the physicality of the temple until a notebook from 1930-31, which you're seeing here, long past the years of the completion of the paintings for the temple. From the beginning, af Klint's paintings registered a decisive departure from conventional representation in favor of groundbreaking imagery. She explained these works as products of mystical receptivity, yet af Klint's active synthesis of the spiritual and scientific ideas of her time, intellectual pursuits she followed through social circles and publications, is evident throughout. Among these threads, theosophy is predominant. Af Klint was a member of the Swedish Lodge of the Theosophical Society, which originated in New York in 1875. The artist's familiarity with the ideas of Theosophy's founder, Madame Helena P. Blavatsky, underlay her beliefs in the search for a divine singularity, a basic unity lost at the moment of the world's creation. Blavatsky saw Theosophy as a science in the service of spiritual wisdom, claiming that modern science, I quote, is every day drawn more into the maelstrom of occultism. Among the most significant scientific developments of the day and of particular interest to artists were new opportunities to perceive the invisible world. Experiments into the nature of matter by scientists such as William Crookes, Wilhelm Röntgen, J.J. Thomson, and Marie Curie, so all in spectroscopy, in X-rays, the discovery of X-rays, of subatomic particles, of radioactivity, were embraced by theosophists as validating their claims for the unseen spiritual aspects of the universe. Blavatsky's disciples, Annie Besant and Charles Ledbetter, used clairvoyant visualizations, observations gathered through human discernment rather than instrumentation, as scientific evidence in their book, Thought Forms and Occult Chemistry, a series of clairvoyant observations on chemical elements. For example, Besant claimed to have recorded clairvoyantly the singular unit of a chemical element, which he termed the ultimate physical atom. to take the form of a heart-shaped vortex comprised of spirals that were themselves comprised of more spirals, and these again of even more minute spirals. Occupying the border between the astral and the material planes, Besant's ultimate physical atom existed as intertwined male and female forces, each wound and spiraling in the opposite direction from the other. For Besant and Ledbetter, the atom, however pseudoscientific their study of it may have been, offered proof that something existed beyond the physical plane and was approached as a means to cosmic knowledge rather than an end in and of itself. Of the many abstract forms that af Klint employed in her work, the spiral seems to have held an enduring interest for her. It is a nuanced subject taking various shapes and presumably diverse symbolic meaning, drawn again from a mixture of faith and science. Spirals initially appear in the automatic drawings of the five and continue throughout the paintings for the temple and beyond. In Primordial Chaos, which is the first series of the paintings for the temple, and one of the series where she describes the process as that she was channeling while she was making the studies for the work, and her hand was being guided by the spirits. Throughout the different series in the cycle of the paintings for the temple, she talks about the relationship of herself to these various spiritual elements in different ways. Sometimes they're guiding her hand, sometimes they're presenting her with images that she is then interpreting onto the canvases or to the paper, and sometimes she's to imagine as if they're standing beside her and guiding her in other ways. And so in this series, Primordial Chaos, it's one of the first and one of the only ones where there are sort of small drawings that exist first that she did while in a trance state, and then translated to canvas. In Primordial Chaos, the winding spiral is an apt symbol for continual growth and change, for progress and evolution. The Darwinian concept of evolution was still a contested subject at the turn of the century, but its model of development and progress had been assimilated across disciplines, including theosophy. As af Klint continued the paintings for the temple, her imagery proliferated like a language. With each series, she layered her recurring motifs with new forms and subjects while exploring formal and conceptual conventions of art making, such as color, scale, balance, and edge. The last group of the paintings for the temple, completed in 1915, are 3 large canvases. Oh, here's one of the 10 largest, the group of paintings that are in the High Gallery, which is about the 4th series within her paintings for the temple, and were done in 1907. You can see the spirals there. And then the last series here, completed in 1915, are 3 large canvases that af Klint called the altarpieces. These, I should just mention, are the 3 works that we are 99% sure that she showed during her lifetime. We know that in 1928 in London, at the World Conference of Spiritual Science and its Practical Applications that was organized by the English Anthroposophical Society, Hilma af Klint presented 3 of her works. She doesn't name them in the writing that we've found about this event, but she gives the sizes of them, and they're above 2 meters, but less than 3 meters. And these are the only 3 paintings that are taller than 2 meters and smaller than the 10 paintings that are part of the other series. And because she considered them kind of the summary of the series so far, the kind of penultimate paintings that would appear at the top of the temple in this altar chamber, it does make sense that these were the ones that she probably decided to put forth. She even traveled to London on the occasion of that conference and gave a presentation about her work. But there's really, so far, not a ripple that can be found from that presentation or from the showing of the works. It was, again, not an art world setting that she showed them within. There are some announcements that are found in newspapers about the conference taking place, but nothing that talks about any artwork that was shown there. Each of the first two paintings here features a gold circle and an equilateral triangle, one with its apex pointing upward, the other downward. The works appear to relate to Theosophy's version of evolutionary theory, in which all the cosmos is undergoing an evolutionary process. Evolution can occur in two directions in that scheme, elevating from the physical to the spiritual and descending from a higher level of being to the limitations of the material world. In the final canvas, a golden orb alone dominates the surface. Inscribed at its center is a six-pointed star, also a theosophical and symbol, and as well as a spiritual symbol and a religious symbol in other forms, formed from the union of two equilateral triangles oriented in opposing directions, symbolizing the universe and its limitations. At 4 points, the orb is pierced by tornado-like spirals, giving form to the energy of evolution. As the culminating expression of the paintings for the temple, the altarpiece were meant to occupy the inner sanctum of af Klint's temple. As she described in a late notebook from 1930-31, wait, I think we missed one, no? Well, sorry. The building was to be round, this temple building that she imagined, like two sites of contemplation and spirit that af Klint knew well. The 12th century church on the island of Munso, where af Klint had a home from 1912 until the end of her life, and Steiner's Gärtneum in Dornach, Switzerland, the seat of anthroposophy, which af Klint regularly visited between 1920 and 1930. Af Klint's designs, which are sketched lightly, I'm afraid, in pencil on the left-hand page here. Af Klint's designs show a three-leveled structure of stacked rings tapering upward and connected by a four-story central tower with a spiral staircase. An altar room sits at the top of af Klint's building. Within each level, devotees would progress inward, spiraling from the periphery to the center on a path in the shape of a spiral, the form so integral in her paintings. They would encounter physical pictures on the ground floor and move upward towards the topmost level to stand before the altarpieces. Af Klint imagined that the construction would be imbued with a certain power and calm, as she called it. The spirals, symbol of evolution, progress, and growth, and linked to forces of nature, embodies and houses af Klint's visions. It was only a year before af Klint recorded her plans for the temple when in 1930, across the Atlantic in New York City, Hilla Rebay began to conceptualize a building to house the abstract paintings that Solomon R. Guggenheim had been collecting under her advisement. "I feel that a museum has to be built," she wrote, "in a fabulous style, with a room to rest in, a large space where pictures are properly stored so that only a few are hung in sequence and only a few great artists are shown. The temple of non-objectivity and devotion. Temple is nicer than church," she wrote in a letter to Rudolf Bauer, I think it was. Rebay would not have encountered af Klint, her work, or of course her plans for the temple in Sweden, beyond the reality that most of af Klint's abstract paintings went unseen during her lifetime. Af Klint's artistic circles were relatively limited in scope compared to Rebay's artist and gallerist relationships, which spanned the art centers of Berlin, Paris, and New York. However, the two artists' stories have compelling points of intersection in their positions at the forefront of abstraction in the early 20th century. Both women were drawn to a number of the same spiritual and intellectual movements, including Rosicrucianism and foremost Blavatsky's Theosophy and Steiner's teachings. And each arrived at a philosophy of art making that embraced the spiritual and intellectual movements of their time, a conception of abstract art fit for a temple. Rebay was born a baroness in Strasbourg, Alsace, in 1890. Around 1904-05, at age 14 and without her parents' knowledge, Rebay attended classes given by Steiner, whose significance to af Klint was burgeoning at around the same moment. While in Paris as an art student at the Académie Julienne from October 1909 until May 1910, Rebay frequented the evening sketching hours at the studio of the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, where she enjoyed a milieu including a number of theosophist artists and writers, and arrived at her commitment to, as she wrote to her mother, living exclusively for art. During this time, Rebay's personal relationship to theosophy evolved, as she explained in a letter to her mother. "You have undoubtedly noticed that I am again very much occupied with theosophy. The deeper I delve into it, the happier it makes me. Everything becomes clear, especially that spiritual sensitivity necessary for an artist to experience nature and to feel one with it." In subsequent years, Rebay maintained her theosophical faith as she commingled her religious life and her aesthetics. Upon seeing a large exhibition of works by Ferdinand Hodler in Munich in 1911, she was so moved by the artist's symbolist motifs and Rosicrucian and theosophical messages that she adopted his views on universal brotherhood. Rebay was committed to the theosophical concept of the reconciliation of all religions and nations, but it was the idea of spiritually guided intuition and inspiration that would most impact her worldview. In 1916, artist and fellow theosophist Jean Arp gave Rebay a copy of Vasily Kandinsky's aesthetic treatise on the spiritual in art, written in 1911, which was itself infused with ideas drawn from Besant, Blavatsky, and Steiner. The book would forever influence Rebay's ideas about art as an expression of cosmic relevance, not individual ego. Rebay came to revere Kandinsky's work and writing, referring to the artist as a prophet of almost religious significance. It was in Kandinsky's writing that Rebay encountered the concept of non-objective art, referring to artworks that have no visual connection to the observable world, art that expressed the inner reality of the maker and, like the work of Klint, privileged spiritual matters over physical descriptions. Kandinsky, like Steiner, is another point of intersection for Rebay and Klint, if for the notoriety of his art and ideas rather than as a mutual acquaintance. There's no evidence to suggest that Klint ever met Kandinsky, as Rebay did eventually. However, she likely encountered his work by 1914. While still creating the paintings for the temple, when some of Klint's figurative paintings were exhibited alongside the Russian artist's abstract canvases in the Baltic exhibition in Malmö in 1914. So Kandinsky is in Munich at the beginning of World War I and is, he's Russian-born, he's living in Munich, he's asked to leave Germany, and he does so by going through Stockholm and through Sweden on his way back to Russia. And he exhibits in Stockholm at that time, as well as in this 1914 Baltic exhibition. He's in the Russian section. Hilma is in the Swedish section. She shows landscape paintings, and he shows abstract work that he was doing at the time. It's really late 1913, I believe, that Kandinsky writes about two works that he does at the end of 1913 and calls them his first fully non-objective paintings. During these years of Kandinsky's first forays into abstraction, his pursuit of art, freed from the task of describing the observable world, relied on looking inward. For Klint, who is similarly pursuing a spiritual means to express and understand the universe, her abstract imagery arose from her drive to connect to a spiritual dimension that was otherwise invisible and unseen. Despite this difference, it's easy to imagine how Klint could have recognized something of her own largely private artistic project in Kandinsky's work. Like Klint's use of abstract forms to convey an unmediated spiritual vision, and following Kandinsky's example, Rebay considered non-objective painting to be the purest form of expression. Rebay's aesthetic worldview, informed in part by the tenets of theosophy and teachings of Steiner and the writings and art of Kandinsky, was coupled with a deeply felt belief in the power of non-objective painting to educate and ameliorate humanity. So closely aligned were non-objective art and spirituality for Rebay that she integrated her beliefs into the formation and promotion of the Guggenheim's collection. When in 1929, the formidable Rebay met Solomon R. Guggenheim in New York, she found a receptive audience for her enthusiasm for non-objective art. Guggenheim quickly hired Rebay to advise in his acquisitions, which she focused on the work of Kandinsky, Moholy-Nagy, Delaunay, Chagall, Leger, and others. By the early 1930s, Rebay was seeking ways to exhibit the collection she had helped shape, and with the ultimate goal of finding a permanent setting for its display. By 1937, the possibility of a temporary home had appeared in the form of a presentation at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, Rebay's sketch that you see here for the proposed exhibition shows Guggenheim's holdings arranged within a circular structure, presaging the Guggenheim Museum's eventual form and unknowingly echoing af Klint's plans to present her own work. In 1943, Rebay wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright, then America's premier architect, inviting him to contemplate a museum to house a collection of non-objective paintings in New York and charging him to create a temple of the spirit, a monument. After generating a series of 6 design phases over 16 years, Wright created a structure oriented around an unbroken spiral that rises more than 6 stories. The architect felt that, unlike a traditional museum space of box-like galleries, the Guggenheim's curved interior would suit the non-objective artworks, allowing them to float free in the space and enhancing their appearance. Wright considered the Guggenheim's abstract exterior an announcement of the type of art to be encountered within. Purely by coincidence, Rebay's temple would share its form with af Klint's. Af Klint and Wright shared an affinity for forms of nature. For both, the spiral embodied continual progress and movement. Af Klint's spiral could signal spiritual ascent or descent. Wright, too, valued its form for its bidirectionality, which in the Guggenheim's ramp would facilitate both visitor circulation and the exhibition of art. He wrote, "Every carpenter that drives a screw proves me standardized and unoriginal. Every spiral spring shows me up. I have found it hard to look a snail in the face since I stole the idea of his house from his back. The spiral is so natural and organic a form for whatever would ascend that I did not see why it should not be played upon and made equally available for descent at one and the same time." Wright modeled his initial designs for the Guggenheim on the ancient stepped pyramids in Egypt and the ziggurats of Assyria and Babylonia. However, once he came to the idea of inverting the ziggurat form, the interior spiral opened up and widened as it ascended, and in Wright's opinion, became a form of pure optimism. The rounded organic form of the logarithmic spiral was a break from tradition and offered a moment of relief in the grid of the city. Wright's spiral embodied both continuity and duality in its marriage of the material and the experiential. Made possible through the use of the newest building materials, steel reinforced concrete, the spiral was concurrently as modern as it was ancient. It was constructed by humans, yet of a form drawn from nature and encompassing growth. Independent of Wright's stance on religion and spirituality, the Guggenheim's monumentality is drawn from these oppositions. After Wright's Guggenheim Museum opened in 1959, following the passing of Solomon Guggenheim in 1949, and Wright, who passed away just months before the building was completed, the architect's wife, Oglavana, encountered her first impressions of the completed museum as she approached it by car. She wrote, the miracle of Fifth Avenue stood as a spirit from another world, glowing with golden bands of light, moving upward in an ever-widening spiral. Rebay and af Klint, both strong-willed artists, were dedicated to their beliefs in the potential of art to hold spiritual value. A generation apart, each woman engaged in the teachings of Blavatsky, Besant, Ledbetter, and Steiner to her own degree, and was informed by a similar set of particularly modern intellectual movements. Rebay's desire to build a temple of the spirit was realized as the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, made possible by a visionary patron and a renowned architect, while af Klint's Temple of the Spirit, the one she envisioned to house her life's work, remained unbuilt. Knowing the extent to which Rebay and af Klint's aesthetic and spiritual ideals were aligned, growing as they did from the same social currents, one is tempted to imagine what could have been if their paths had meaningfully crossed. With their shared commitments, would they have recognized the context that Rebay's temple could have provided for af Klint's paintings? This is a question we'll never be able to answer, but following the examples of the two artists, we can perhaps push beyond the material facts to a realm beyond and envision other possibilities.